Great. So for this first training, the plan here is that we're going to basically be going through and recreating one of these flows. And so this is a flow, and the reason why we're gonna go through, so it will make sense in a second. But this is actually the first presidential debate, and it's the total count of interruptions. So this was someone's data set that they actually watched the whole debate and counted every interruption that happened, and then they also counted the duration. So, or actually, the second view is when those interruptions occurred. So during the length of the debate, when did the actual interruptions occur? And then third, how long was each interruption? So once they interrupted, how long did they keep speaking for? And so the main insight, was described here is that the amount of time that Trump spoke was much greater than Biden, as well as was more frequent. And then this last view is actually adding up all of the amount of time, so you can see that in total, Donald Trump interrupted for 10 minutes and 10 seconds, and Biden was 1 minute and 22 seconds. And the reason I want to focus on this one is that it's sort of a very simple model to get started with, just in terms of the complexity of the data. But what you're starting to see here is moving through different perspectives, that we start with the exact same data set, but we're looking at it through different layers, and that each layer reveals sort of a different insight. So this first insight is just the total count. Then it's when those interruptions occurred, where we can see it's pretty much evenly spaced out throughout the debate. And then third is the actual amount of time for each of those interruptions. And then last is sort of totaling all those up. So you can see how these sort of build on one another, and we could mix and match and shift these around, but that it tells a sort of an interesting story, and I think is a easy, sort of a good way to get started and sort of wrapping your head around some of the core concepts that flow introduces. One of which being that data shouldn't go away, but rather you should always be keeping it cognitively coherent, so that data is sort of moving from one visualization to the next. So that's sort of where I think we'll start today. Before I get going in terms of how to do it, any initial questions or thoughts? Okay. So you guys are all geared to dive in. And so how we're going to do this is we're just going to rotate who's presenting their screen. But instead of me sort of presenting the whole time, we're going to have each one of you guys sort of present your screen during portions of this, and we'll help each other out to actually build this out. So what I'm going to do first is this is the actual data set. And I'm going to copy the link and paste this into the chat window. And for the YouTube people, I will put that into the comments section or the info description. And so let me just quickly go through this. I'll share my screen since I think the resolution will be a little harder to see. And so what is in this? So the first column, and this was extrapolated out from a different data set that timed everything. And so I just pulled out just the interruptions. Then the start time in seconds of when the interruption started, when the interruption stopped, the total time, which is a calculated field based on the start time and end time, who it was, and then this total time, which is just the running sum of the interruption time, if that makes sense. And then this last one, I think, is, converting seconds to minutes to show the data that way. Oh, and then this last column is actually, so one thing we can do is in the data set itself, we can define the color using hexadecimal values, which is, if you just search for this, you'll see how it's the hex code for a specific color. So the reason I did it for this one is that because Republican and Democrat is so associated with certain colors at this point, just hard coding that into the data as opposed to having more generic colors just made more sense. But that's something we'll cover when we jump over that hurdle. So any questions on the data set itself, or or if you guys have been able to download that CSV file? Okay. All right, cool. So let's we'll go in reverse order here from where we started. So I think Michael, let's start with you for if you want to share your screen so we can follow along with you, and then we'll get started building this out.
All right, sounds good.
Cool.
So can you guys see it?
Yes, just showed up. Perfect.
Okay.
All right, perfect. See here in the tutorial. Great. So let's go ahead and can you click the stop button? So I think you're in sort of the tutorial prompt,
Yeah,
if I recall correctly.
I was messing with it before the meeting.
Yeah, no, that's great. It's good to see. So let's actually click on the home button, which is the top left-hand corner. And so for everyone, once you're, I guess as a first question, was everyone able to log in to the platform? Joe and Brian?
Yep.
And Ed? Okay.
I'm getting there right now.
Getting there now? Okay. So once you're in the platform, so it's a.flow.gl, we're going to click on create flow first, and that will open up a prompt to create a flow. And you can title it anything you'd like. You can change this at a different point in time, so you don't have to spend too much emphasis here. The checkbox for allow remix, it doesn't matter as much as it used to. But the intent there was that for publicly published flows, that someone could basically pick it up and then remix it and publish a different version of it. But right now, that public flows are not readily available for everyone to see, and so that's a little less of a concern. But just so you can understand what that button does. And so let's go ahead and click on create from there. And so we'll be in this three-dimensional environment right from the get-go, and can dive in.
I'm there. Thanks, Mike.
Perfect. Awesome. Great. And so, awesome. All right. So the first thing we're going to do is actually upload the data itself. And so to do that, we're going to click on the Data tab over on the left-hand side of your screen. Yep. And then click on Create New. And you'll notice that this same prompt sort of is on every page. It's always create new, so you're creating a new object, whether it be a text object or something else, and then you're adding details. And so, yeah, you had it exactly right. So we're going to click on that Upload View button, and yep, you got it. So I guess before we do that, so we'll have to, on the actual data set itself,
Yeah.
You're going to go File, Download, and then download it as a CSV, so a comma-separated value. So that's the main data set that we typically work with. And yeah, unfortunately, we don't have the drag and drop going yet. That's a good note for us to think about adding. But yeah, you'll select from your downloads. And yep, so now essentially you've loaded that CSV file onto our local servers or onto our AWS servers so that you can use that data within the flow itself. So I'll pause there to see where everyone's at.
I think I'm good so far. I understand everything.
Yeah, I'm good, Michael. Once I've
absolutely.
loaded the data, I can hit close, correct?
Yes. Yep. After you loaded the data, we can click close.
Great.
Perfect. And then what we'll do is click on Swarm next.
Swarm? Okay.
Mm-hmm. And so Swarm is the main data visualization element. And so we're going to click on Create New. And this will create a new swarm. And then we're going to need to tell it what data source to look at. So you can upload multiple data files, but then have a swarm basically point to it. And so under that drop down where it says none, if you click on where it says none, you'll be able to then select the previous data source you had entered. And so right away, you're seeing every dot in that field is actually every row of the data set. And so if you can actually click and drag, and you'll actually move around the environments and get a little bit of a sense for this three-dimensional world we're in. And I believe that the very first step, if you can recall what I presented, and I'll actually paste that here as a link as well, sort of as reference material, is to start out with basically just a title screen. So nothing too complex. But what I'd like to do here is that instead of having all of these dots taking up a lot of space, there is sort of this nice dynamic of having all the dots sort of consolidated into one and then seeing them expand. And so to do that, what we're going to do is underneath where it says chart type, let's set the width, height, and depth to 0. And so by doing that, it's basically going to make all of these points go to one spot. And as you've updated this, you'll notice that the preview window is essentially updating along with you. And that there's more things you could do there, right? That you could add some depth and width, and there's actually a lot of things you can do underneath this chart type of random that are a little more powerful. And then what we're going to do next is add some text. So let's click on text.
Text.
Which is over on the left side. Yep. It's just sort of like adding a, like a text box into a PowerPoint in some sense.
Gotcha.
Except you're in a 3D environment. So that's going to be the key constraint or the key factor here. So yeah, you click on create new. Perfect. And you'll notice that this font size defaults with 0.03, which is a pretty good size. I would highly recommend that you don't go less than 0.015. And I can go into more details on why, but essentially when you go into augmented reality mode, where it's actually in your environment, when it's less than that 0.15, it's just a little difficult to read, or you have to get really close to it. So that's just sort of a rule of thumb. And so for this, let's go ahead and change that text. So instead of saying new text 1, we're going to replace that with interruptions during the first presidential debate. Perfect. Nice. Awesome. Cool. And obviously there's more formatting things we can do here, but the one thing I want to point your attention to is that there's this little button that says face camera, and it's right underneath alignment. Yep, right there.
Okay.
Yep, and if you click that, essentially what it does is that text will now always face the camera, and that's often something you want to do when you're in a 3D environment, because if you're behind the text or you're to the left or the right of the text, then you won't be able to see it. And so in most instances, you want that checked, unless there is a specific reason you want the text to be in a specific direction. And so if you can scroll down a little further, the other thing I want to point your attention to is this position. So when you create a new object, it automatically creates that object a certain set distance away from you. But you might want to have it sort of in the center of the scene, if that makes sense. So right now it's actually pretty close to the center, but if you had moved the camera to another position and added the text objects, it might be in a different spot. But as a sort of a design paradigm to sort of keep in mind is that we try to keep everything around the origin and then maybe move it vertically up and down, but that you want the center point to be the center point, if that makes sense. So this will start to make more sense as we keep going here. And so what I would recommend here for you, Michael, is let's just move that text object up just a little bit so we can still see the dot. And so there's two ways to do that. Yeah, so you can update it there, or you can use that green arrow that's pointing, that's on the object itself, and be able to move it that way. And so that's often the easier thing to move. Perfect. So we have set the first step. And so what we'll do here, let me check in with everybody and see where everyone's at. We all good? Cool.
All good.
You guys
Yeah.
are fast. Like it. Ed, are you all good? Or would
I'm good, yeah.
Good? Okay, cool. So let's click on Add Step, which is in the very top left-hand corner. And what this will do is create another step, which is essentially copying the step you're on. And you'll notice that there's this little train track that starts in the very bottom of the screen. And this is how we move from step to step. And so what we'll do in this second step, and let's actually switch over, and let's have Joe. Why don't we have you present your screen next, and that way we'll
and leads right into a question I was going to have, so that's good.
Oh, perfect.
All right, can you see the
Yes.
screen? Okay. Yeah, the question I had is, where do you find a logical, like in your workflow, where do you find a logical separation for these steps?
So I think of the steps as essentially equivalent to, like a slide in a PowerPoint deck or a keyframe in an animation. You're essentially setting these perspectives that you want to draw someone's attention to. And that's sort of how I think of steps. Does that address your question or
It does, because you do it in the sense of a presentation and an interaction versus a logical step through, let's say the steps on the left versus, an interaction. So yeah, no, it makes total sense.
That makes sense? Okay. Yeah, and there's other things you can adjust if you want to show something over time, or you can change the duration between steps to show things moving and things like that we can get into. But that's sort of at a more generic level how we think about it. So on this step, so now we're on step 2. And so for this step, let's go ahead and uncheck the visible on this step button, which essentially will turn off that text object. So the text object is visible on the first step, and now we're turning it off for the second step. And so that's all that's occurring.
Where's that box? Oh, yep, sorry.
You see,
Apply visibility to all steps.
So it's there's a little box just to the left of that, which is blue.
Yep, got it.
And if you uncheck that, it essentially turns it off. Yep.
Thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. And so on this next step, what we're going to be doing is doing the count of interruptions. And so what we're going to do is click on swarm. And on this swarm, we want to create a new perspective. And so you'll skip, exactly. So there's this button called new perspective. And let's just call this counts. And perfect. And so with this new perspective, we now want to change the chart type. And so instead of the type being random, we're going to do categorized columns. And the category, I believe, will be who.
Which one? I'm sorry. Oh, who? Okay, sorry.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Perfect. And so you'll see it jump into position there. And there's some formatting things we're going to want to update just to make it look a little bit cleaner. So the first thing I'm going to recommend we do is let's update the size of the dots underneath sizes. And let's make that 0.015. And that's actually a little further down. There's a little section called sizes.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was your size recommendation?
0.015. And it looks like that might be something about, yeah, there we go. Cool. So they're getting bigger, but then they're clumping over each other. And so now if we look back at chart type, let's go ahead and update the spacing between points. And if you just keep adjusting that till it starts to look good. Yeah, that's good. So like 0.05, 0.06, something like that looks good. And then probably a column gap. We want to increase that column gap up a little bit. That'll just put some more space in between the two. And then the last thing I'd recommend here is that underneath color, one thing we defined in color was we defined the colors in the data set itself. And so we can click on column in data and select the column color. And this will change the color of these the data points to the color we specified in the data set. There is another way we can do that, where instead of clicking column in data, if you click that drop down and instead do color scheme, and we can do the color scheme based on color, or we can change it based on, so that's just different color combinations. And this is something we're adding more to and allow you to define your own sort of color palettes. But in the meantime, adding it to the data set is sort of the easiest way to have complete control over it. So we'll just go back to column and data. Yeah, great. And so, some of the other details here. So let's add some more text to this. Yep, so click on text, create new, perfect. And this is a good instance where learning recognizing you're in a 3D environment actually can be it's really helpful, because while it looks like they're on the same plane, if you actually click off of it and rotate around, you'll see that it's actually way in front. And so this is where keeping attention to what the position is really helpful. And so what I'd recommend is if you scroll down on the screen, you'll see the position is all these other objects. And what I like to do is hit that minus sign next to each one of them to set the position to 0. So that way it's right at the origin, and then I can move it from there. And so now that it's at the origin, I can move it up or left and right to get it into the spot I want. And so for this, let's go ahead and put it, you can put it below, that's fine. And this is just going to be the count of interruptions. And so if we want to add the label to say count of interruptions.
Wow, this is sensitive on the slider.
I actually recommend using the what Joe's using, which is the actual arrows that attach to the object itself. I
Gotcha,
found those to
understood.
be much more user
Yeah,
friendly.
I was using the plus or the minus or sliding it on the dot, and
Those are challenging.
I
Yeah.
slid it through the floor.
Yeah, it's a little tricky. And the other thing to note is that those sliders, up, down, left, right, close, far, is relative to your camera. So it's not, if that makes sense. So if your camera's in a different position, it's moving closer or further from that camera position. So just a
And
different control mechanism.
We're changing the text to what? Count of interruptions?
Yeah, kind of
I'm sorry.
interruptions. And so you'll notice here, Joe, that we have that one not facing camera, but instead as just a set rotation, which I think is fine in this case because there is actually only really one way to to look at it. So cool. We've set up this second step now. So let's go ahead and click Add Step, and then we will jump over to Brian. If you want to share your screen, Brian, we'll move on to this next step.
Yes.
Perfect.
Sorry to interrupt. I think I missed a step in the data. The dots for the Trump versus Biden interruptions were not showing up for me. Is
Okay.
there any way I
Yeah,
could
do you wanna share
my
your
screen?
Yeah, if you could share your screen real quick.
Thank you.
Let's see where we're at.
So I'm pretty sure I followed everything the way you said. I don't know. Maybe I forgot to click something.
No, all good. Great. So if you click back on, if you go to step 2, and the way to get to step 2 is by clicking on the train track. Yeah, you got it. Great. And can you click on step 1 for me real quick? Okay, so we got that one. Okay, so if you click back on step 2, let's adjust the swarm. So click on swarm for me. And let's see here. Can you scroll down just a little bit?
Looks like it's the default perspective still.
Yeah. If you click on where it says defaults and click on counts. Okay, I think I see what happens. Can you do me a favor and click on save and then refresh the page itself? So I think what's happening is that there was a perspective that was created, but some attribute was not valid, or there was some error in that perspective, which is why you're not able to select the other perspective. So anyways, let's go back to that step 2 that you're on, or that you were at, and then click on swarm again. Right, so I see counts is showing, good. And then if you can click back on step 1 for me, and change the perspective to default. Okay, yeah, see that's where, okay. If you can do me a favor, instead of underneath chart type, oh, I see what's going on. So underneath category column, can you change that to who?
This one?
Just above that.
Oh.
Actually, just yeah, under that. Can you change that to random?
Random. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. See, something's happening.
Yeah. Okay. I see what's going on now. Okay. Cool. So yeah. So what we're gonna do on this one is, can you go ahead and click save and refresh for me real quick? And the reason we're saving and refreshing is that there's still sometimes where the preview window is different than what is actually in the JSON. And so if you can click on swarm for me again, I think we've resolved it. So we start off with a default perspective, and let's go ahead and change width, height, and depth to 0 on those. So width to, yeah, change those to 0. I think we'll be back to where we were before. Okay. Yep. And then if you click on the second step, great.
So it's showing up now.
Yeah,
Perfect,
so now it's showing up.
you.
And so there was just, and this happens sometimes when you have an older perspective that somehow got changed, and it looks like the older perspective got changed from random to categorized columns, but there wasn't a category column selected. And so it was sort of in this in-between state where it didn't quite work. So anyways, that's sort of what happened there. And then the other thing to note is that you can't really see the labels on this. And if you scroll down, so let's make the size 0.015. 0.15 is actually really big, and it's hard to get used to what values work and what values don't. I know that's it'll just take time to to address all that. And so yeah, you'll want to adjust the spacing and some other stuff. Yeah, you got it. So I'll let you sort of play around with that a little bit to get to a position you want. But thanks for stopping us, and that's a good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. All right, so let's switch back, and I think Brian, you were gonna share your screen. Perfect. All right, so we are on this third step, and so this third step is when we start to add some depth to this. So let's once again, let's click on on that text object. Let's go ahead and turn off that text object, or another thing. Yeah, so we'll unselect that, and then let's go ahead and just title it right away, and then we can change it after. And so let's click on duplicate.
And Michael?
Yep.
How do we know we're on the next step?
Yeah, so you're going to want to look at the train tracks on the very bottom. And so that's going to tell you, that little diamond is going to show you what step you're on.
All right, so if I only have 2 stops on the train track, that means I have to go to add step first.
Correct. Yes, exactly.
Thank you. Sorry.
No, good question. Great. And so when we duplicate a text object, it basically takes the same parameters and duplicates it and puts it right underneath it. So it won't be in the exact same position, but it will be below where it was before. And so I think the title for this one is like when each interruption occurred. Awesome. Cool. And then we can move that one around and some other parameters. But let's click on swarm next. And on the swarm, let's create a new perspective. And let's just say maybe like time series. Perfect. And so now underneath chart type, we're going to change that from categorized columns, and we're going to change that to scatter plot. Great. And so on this scatter plot, on the horizontal axis, let's go ahead and say who. Yep. And then on the vertical axis, let's actually uncheck that one. So this first view, we're not going to add the height. And then on the depth axis, let's choose, I think it's, which one is it? I think start time or end time, or if you select minute at the very end, that will make it a little more interpretable. So we could use the start time or end time, but it's just going to be in seconds, which just makes it a little odder to look at, I'd say. So a few things to note here. So the first thing I'd like to point everyone's attention to is when we show the width, height, and depth as 1, that literally means 1 meter. So if you were to go into augmented reality, this is going to be a 1 meter wide by 1 meter deep by 1 meter tall object. And so we can adjust those parameters. And so for this example, it might make sense on the the width axis to make it a little shorter or narrower. So something like 0.25 or a quarter of a meter might be a little bit more interpretable. And you can obviously adjust those however you see fit. The other thing to note is that on the depth range shows the minimum and a maximum. And that automatically is updated based on your data set. And so the reason I point that out is that it's not starting at 0, which is oftentimes how you want to show data. So you show the origin or the axis. And so that's something to take into account. And the other thing to note is that it's going in sort of a backwards order than I think what we would typically do. And so there's 2 ways to address that. One is that you just move the camera to the other side, so the 180 degrees from where it's at. And then the other option is to actually just update the min-max so that the minimum is actually like 100 and then the maximum is 0. And that will basically swap the order of how this looks. So now we're going the other way. So two little like tricks, I guess, or not tricks, but some details there. So I'll pause there since I know that's a little more
Yeah, I
complicated.
got lost on this step, Michael.
Yep, absolutely. So let's go ahead and have Ed, if you want to
I'll
share your screen real quick.
Okay.
Perfect.
Something right at the beginning I could never get. I think I hit create new on Swarm and then I lost my.
Ah, okay. Got it. Yeah, it
But
looks
I'm
like you
on
created a
step 3.
new swarm. And so if you click on that, there's a little drop down with a search, like a search icon. Yeah. And you can go ahead and select swarm 1. Yep. So
Okay.
now you're back in. And so that other swarm, you can just delete or leave it there. It doesn't really matter
Okay.
too much.
So I lost, that's what I did. I lost my data. That's why. Okay.
Yep. Yeah, all good. And so
All right.
on this one, you're going to want to click create a new perspective. And so, yep, so new perspective, which is just to the right of where it says counts, sort of in the middle of your screen to the right. And there's a little plus icon right next to it.
Oh, sorry.
Yep, so it's, yeah, new perspective. There you go. So for this one, let's just label it like time series.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm. Great. And then, yep. And so then, yep. So what we're going to want to do with this is change the chart type from categorized columns to scatter plot.
You.
Perfect. And then on the horizontal axis, let's put who. Mm-hmm. The vertical axis, let's actually uncheck that box so we don't show the vertical axis. And then on the depth axis, let's go ahead and select, I think it's minute, which is at the very, very bottom. Perfect. And so then I think the only other things we can change here, or would like to change, is the width. Let's go ahead and make the width like 0.25, 0.25. And then on the depth range, let's go ahead and make the minimum 100 and then the maximum 0. And that will swap the order of how these are showing. There we go. Cool. So we are grooving now. Like it. Okay, so I think we're all on this step. Any other
Thank you.
questions or?
Is there a way to flip where the axis label is? So instead of being at the top, it could be at the bottom.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's. I'm gonna have you present your screen again, Brian.
I'll kill it. Sorry.
All good. All right. So we're gonna get into some more advanced stuff here. So if you scroll down on the perspective on the swarm and open up axis options, which is the very bottom. Yep. And so these are some of the axes options. And I think the one you're looking for is underneath that next drop down, which is axis label offsets. And okay, that didn't open. So I'm gonna note that. But the way you open that is if you click on the 3 dots in the very top right-hand corner, and then click on advanced. So we hide a lot of options underneath this advanced tab, so it doesn't clutter and sort of makes it a simpler UI. But yeah, now you can see sort of all the options. So there's the axis labels, which are the titles like who and minutes. And then there's also the actual tick labels, which is like 0, 10, 20, as well as Biden and Trump. And so all of those are adjustable in terms of where they are. Additionally, there's some other parameters here which we can go into. One sort of detail that I think I use quite often is that if you scroll up, there is, so right there, there's a section called width axis font size, height axis font size. And the trick is that if you want a label to go away, for instance, who, Like we don't need to label who, since Trump and Biden are pretty self-explanatory. We can just set that label to something really small, so like 0.00001, and that will go away. And the reason we have to do it that way is that if you put a 0 there, it actually defaults back to something that's really big. And anyways, it's just like a small detail here that we're a little bit of working around for now, but something that likely you'll find valuable.
With axis font size, that's what we're changing?
Yes, exactly. Yep. And that's how you can get rid of like the label.
Right.
And you can always just add a text object for now. So I will say the label parameters is something that there's just so many options at times that we're still building out a lot of those features. So if you're getting stumped on something, do reach out and we can go through that. And yeah, actually, what you're clicking on, Brian.
That was all under label, right?
Sorry, what was that, Joe?
That was under label, right?
No, it's actually underneath Axis Options.
Okay, there it is. Okay, I missed it. I didn't scroll enough. Thank you.
Yep. Let me take just 3 notes real quick. Okay, awesome. Great. Cool. So since we're underneath this section, I'm just going to show you guys a few other things since you guys are moving quite quick and quite advanced. This is good. So what we'll do is on the tick labels face camera, that essentially defines how the actual tick labels, if they face you or if they stay static. Right now they will stay static unless you tell them to track, which is often the case. You want them to track. So like, yeah, for the depth, you now have that all tracking so that if you start to rotate around, you'll see that the numbers for the minutes is always going to be showing correctly or facing you. So that's what that does. And then the other thing, which I think is kind of fun to do sometimes, is there's something that says grid, which is visible on your screen. It's right underneath show width axis, show height axis, show depth axis. There's a little drop down underneath grid. And on that, if you can select bottom, and it might have frozen, at least for me, Brian.
Okay.
Is it updating on your side?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let me just stop and restart.
Yeah, all good. And I think let's actually switch over to Ed actually, anyways, because we're gonna add a step right after this, anyways. So Ed, if you wanna share your screen for this next step, and this is where we get to add some more fun dimensionality here. And there's obviously other things we'd want to change, to like that text so that you have it above, and there's some other things we'll adjust, but for now, let's just sort of keep it where we are, and let's go ahead and add a step. Perfect. And so now on this step, what we're going to do is go back to swarm. Okay, so we have swarm open, so let's go ahead and create a new perspective in this swarm. And so you'll notice that we're sort of doing a lot of repetition of this idea of that you create a new step and then you change the perspective of the swarm. And that's something that, on purpose. It's the whole idea here is that you'll start to see how you start to use steps and perspectives to build these transitions. Great. And so on this new perspective name, we can just call this maybe interruption duration, or we could even just label it step 5. Yeah, perfect. Great. So now let's click on that vertical axis drop, or that checkbox for vertical axis. And so we're going to keep the same dimensions for the width and depth. And now on the vertical axis, let's go ahead and I think it's called interruption time, or total time. Yeah, total time. So underneath the column for vertical axis, if you select total time, It's basically the difference between the start time and the end time. And so if you if you zoom out, and to zoom out, you just scroll, use your mouse wheel to scroll out or in, and that will basically zoom you out and in. And what you'll see is that we see this dimensionality, and perhaps it's just a little tall. So let's go ahead and change the height. Instead of one being 1 meter tall, let's make it maybe something more like half a meter tall, so 0.5. Perfect. And then the other thing to note is that the height range starts at 1, and so I'd recommend that we start that at 0 to be consistent, to always have 0 be on the axis. Yep. So yeah, right where you're at. So change that to 0. Perfect. And so the while the dots are at the right spot, we don't see this bar connecting them. And so what we're going to do for this is click on Connections, which is over on the left-hand side. And then click on Create
Is there a
New.
difference between the connections on the left-hand side and the caret drop-down connections on the right versus the left?
Yeah, great. So that was actually a more recent update where we added it into Swarm, that you can just get to connections directly. Because if you think about it, I mean, ultimately what we're going to be getting to is like, I want to create a, line chart, or I want to create an XYZ chart with labels and all these other attributes. And right now those are sort of separate primitives or separate components with connections and the actual dots, which we call swarms. And so that's sort of where it's evolving to, and that's part of the same direction. So what you're clicking on connections underneath swarm is the exact same thing. Yep. And so on this connections, Ed, let's go ahead and tell it which swarm to look at. So underneath where it says swarm in yellow, we'll click on swarm 1. Yep. And then this one might be a little non-intuitive, but if you click on connection type, there is a drop down for what's called scatter drop lines. And what that does is it's always in the Y direction, but it goes from whatever dot to the base, whether that base be a map or it could be, in this case, the origin.
Drop line, okay.
Yep. Yeah. And so there's other things we can change here. So you can change the opacity of that dot. So instead of it being completely opaque like it is now, we can actually make it a little more transparent. But we don't have to spend too much time going into a lot of the details here. And so the last thing we're going to want to do here is let's go ahead and just turn off that other text object, that's in the scene. And so there's 2 ways to do that. If you can click on the text object that says count of interruptions when interruptions occurred directly. Yeah. And just uncheck the visible on this step. And then the other way to select it is actually using that drop down towards the top of the screen. That's sort of the other way to select the object itself.
Cool. Okay.
All right, so now we've added some dimensionality. So we're actually using all 3 dimensions, so we know when this occurred and then how long each interruption happens. And so let's do one last step, which is if you click on Add Step. Yep, and this will be the final step here. Oh, and I realize we're almost at time, so I've got to be cognizant of that. So yeah, so on this step, let's go ahead and click on Swarm. Actually, I'm gonna pause here. So there is one last step, which is basically just doing another scatter plot, but lining them all up over top of each other. But I'm gonna skip that because I want to make sure to address any questions you all have. And Brian, I know you had a specific question on something you were working on, and I do want to try to address that as well. So that being said, here what we've done, on a very holistic basis is trying to teach sort of the idea of adding steps, the idea of using one data set, but showing multiple perspectives of that data set in order to tell a narrative and to tell a story. And so the last step is really clicking that save button and clicking publish. And when you publish it, anyone with the link that you'll see underneath the share icon will have access to be able to see this flow no matter what device they're on. And so if you click on And even if you, yeah, so if you click publish, it'll be anyone can access it. And if you don't want anyone to access it, but instead want to share it just with selected people, if you click on that share icon, you'll see there's a few options underneath share. So that URL at the top there is the public URL that anyone can go to once it's published. Or you can share it with a specific person by typing in their email or username. The one sort of caveat right now is that that user needs to be registered with Flow in order for it to be shared with them. So we're still working on the functionality of where you share it, and it sends them an email to sign up and all of that. So that's sort of the one caveat there.
Do you recommend that I unpublish this, Michael?
No, it's fine. It won't show up anywhere when it's published, so there's not like
Okay.
a public page right now.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah, so you're all clear there.
But in theory, I could go back to this and edit and work on it and play with it.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay.
Cool. So, Joe, Michael, Brian, what other questions do you guys have?
I got lost when we added the third dimension, and after I missed that step,
Sure.
I started to look at like how you guys are adding the lines and stuff. So if I could share my screen and if you could help me add the third dimension, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, let's do it.
Thank you.
All
So
right.
this is where I am right now.
Awesome. So let's click on Create New Perspective.
Is it not this
or-
one?
Yeah, that one. Sorry,
Or is
just New Perspective.
Okay,
Yep.
I thought I did this, but so this is just number or duration. What was this?
Yeah,
actually?
just you can name it anything or just the duration. Perfect. And yep. And so then what we're gonna do is we're gonna check that box that says vertical axis. And then underneath column, we're gonna select total time.
Okay, that's what I missed.
Yep, and that's that. So you did total time sum, which is actually kind of cool too, because you can see it build over time, which is actually kind of
I see.
that's actually pretty sweet. I kind of like that. Yeah, or total time, which shows the specific duration. And then the
That's
last
really
thing
cool.
to do here is click on connections, and you can do that by the left hand side or within the swarm itself. Create new. Yep, and then tell it to connect to swarm 1. So right above that one, yep, swarm 1, and then the connection type. Let's click on that, and then click on scatter drop lines.
Oh, beautiful.
So there you go.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Awesome. And then, Joe and Brian. And Brian, I know you had a specific question on something not from this flow, but something you were working on. So happy to jump into that as well.
Yeah, no, I think actually the going through this data set helped me see where I was making some mistakes just in the way I was grouping some things together.
Got it.
So
Makes sense. Yeah, and one thing that we didn't really jump into here, but I think is sort of valuable to understand is the ability to set the camera position for each of these steps. So if I create a flow quick, there's a button here in the top left-hand corner which sets the camera position, so that if I have some text, and so I start here, set the camera position there, add a step, then I zoom in and set a camera position there. That if I click on steps on this top left-hand corner, I can see that progression. And I think underneath advanced, you can actually set the duration of time between the steps. So you can actually make it super long and dramatic, or short and quick. And so these are sort of some more advanced things to think about, but I think are part of the storytelling, as well as there's this text box up here, which is what we call overlay text, and allows you to tell a story that if you're not there to actually speak it through in some sense, that you can have sort of the commentary and the description of what you're going through up there. So those are some other things to keep in mind. But with that, I'd like to, thank you guys for joining this first flow training, and hopefully it was helpful to get you going. Obviously this is not the most revolutionary data set or data story in the world, but hopefully a good sort of introduction to some of the platform. And so please don't hesitate to reach out with other questions. we're really here to empower you and excited to see where you guys take the platform. So I really appreciate your engagement, and it's been fun to get to know you guys for a little bit.
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks
nice
a
to meet
lot,
you.
Michael. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you very much. It was great.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Michael. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Ed. Talk
Thanks.
to you guys soon. All right, bye.
Bye.